Peter Thiel talked about the Bitcoin price, the BTC USD price, is the only unfakeable signal in global markets. Everything else is fake. Because obviously Chinese markets are totally fake, and many of the US markets are actually very fake. But that signal was a signal of exit, and it was very hard to fake because it was a real signal. And if that moons in time, it is a fire alarm that says that something is wrong and that the money is gone. Right? That is the signal that basically says, boom, like this, actually they're hyperinflating the currency, they're printing so much, and I'm getting to a safe haven. And once people see that mooning, then that becomes something that other people around the world see and other dollar holders see, and they realize, okay, a new reserve currency is being born. Okay. And this is actually probably how Bitcoin becomes what we've always thought it would be, which is the global reserve currency of the world. It's just something that's going to be much more messy, I think, than anybody expected.
Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor-based, so all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer.
Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the world's first startup accelerator program focused exclusively on the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what is possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com today to apply for the program or learn more. Again, that is wolfnyc.com.
Hey everybody, we're going to start talking about what's going on with this big Bitcoin bet.
Hey, what's up, Robert?
Hey man, we've got Gladstein here.
Yeah, so do we just want to start, get things going and lay the framework here, Robert?
Yeah, I think I liked where you suggested we start it, just talking about the general idea, right, about Bitcoin eating all the money, and this just seems to be like a trigger event. So I think you would be the man for the job to lay that out.
Yeah, so that's obviously the bet in some ways, is that he's essentially betting that the markets understand that this thing has no counterparty risk. It has market risk like everything else, but everything else has counterparty risk, and this doesn't. And that's something that I think some people are starting to realize right now. So I think that's the bet. And I think it's a reasonable bet. I mean, obviously it's a big ass bet. It's very bold, but hey, it could happen now. It could happen next year. It could happen 5 years from now. I wouldn't want to be taking the other side of the bet. We'll put it that way. Does that make sense? I would be very uneasy about that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think in general, this is the thesis that Bitcoiners have long been expressing, that, what is the old, I forget who's accredited or attributed with a quote, but there's decades where nothing happened, then weeks when decades happen, kind of thing. And, I think when Balaji gets on here, I'm sure he'll explain his case a bit more, but he just sees something that maybe most of us don't, that the fragility in this existing system is about to rupture. And, there's nothing there from a thesis standpoint that's different than what Bitcoiners have been saying for years and years and years. This big surprising thing here for me is just the timing, which I'm as excited as everyone else to hear what he has to say about it.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that I think most of us are like afraid of such a transition, right? Like, obviously, such a transition could include a lot of social unrest. Obviously, there's the Trump stuff going on. There's war going on. There's collapse going on in a lot of nations right now. The Fed is breaking the banking system right now, but they just finished breaking dozens of emerging market countries in the last year with their policy. So there's a lot of fear. And, I think we could entertain the possibility that it might not go down that way. Like, there is a possibility that this transition happens in a way where, like, the financial markets just reprice things and there's a composition change, but it doesn't necessarily cause like massive social unrest. I'd at least like to hope that, because if not, then it is a dark view. But we have Balaji here now.
Hello, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can hear you.
All right. So I actually published like a rationale for why I'm thinking what I'm thinking. I'm just gonna I'm gonna retweet that, and I'm gonna just kind of read it out and explain, just kind of a prepared sort of statement, because there's a totally different frame on events, and if you add it all up, it actually is fairly concerning. And I think my mental model, you've been feeling totally independent of me. You've been feeling the heat go up with the discount window, $150 billion going to banks, with $200 billion bankruptcies overnight, with Trump saying he's getting arrested and calling for people in the streets. There's a lot of sources of heat that have absolutely nothing to do with anything Bitcoin related. Bitcoin is just the exit at this point. And so let me just kind of explain my thesis on where we actually are, which is totally different, I think, from the narrative that you might have seen in the mainstream press. So it is actually a kind of a stunning way of thinking about it. But if you look at, can everybody see what I just retweeted here? Actually, maybe you can share this tweet. But it's like a mini essay. It's got about 14 references. And you should click all those references and you should look at all those graphs. In the short version, I'll try and give the 1 minute, 10 minute, and then 100-minute version with Q&A. The 1 minute version is the banks have been insolvent, the central bank and the major banks like Bank of America and the small regional banks, community banks, and the Fed and FDIC and the banks themselves, so the central bank, the bank regulators, and the banks themselves have known about this for the last year at least, because this all happened when the Fed hiked rates after basically saying that it was going to keep them low for a while. And so we essentially have a bunch of crazy looking graphs going down and to the right that everybody was aware of within the banking system. But, a good analogy is Uncle Sam Bankman-Fried. Just like Sam Bankman-Fried sort of lied to himself and lied to you with this sort of crazy accounting that made him seem solvent when he actually wasn't. All of the banks are actually like that. And all right, so I'm just going to kind of read it. So just as in 2008, the bankers lied. We should have remembered that they lied. This time, the central bankers, the banks, and the bank regulators have lied to all dollar holders and depositors, not just innocent Americans, but also all of these huge foreign holders of treasuries and other, let's call them dollar correlated things. And this isn't your typical fractional reserve situation, which is sort of a built-in instability anyway. Remember, the Fed rejected the narrow bank. They wouldn't allow just a pure one-to-one bank, as Lynn Alden tweeted about. This isn't your typical fractional reserve situation. The technical way of saying it is, there isn't enough in the banks on a mark-to-market basis to cover withdrawals, meaning they're treating something as being worth $1,000 because they're using this hold to maturity accounting, but it's not worth $1,000. Actually, when it's sold, it'd be worth a lot less than that. And that means that if you come there and you ask for your dollars, they don't have it. Just like, SBF was doing some crazy accounting on the back and he convinced himself, convinced others that he had 100 cents on the dollar. But when the actual demand came, he didn't, right? And they knew this through all of last year and communicated internally in their coded language. And the key phrase is unrealized losses. And if you look at this, there's a few links that you can look at. So, for example, there's the Kansas City Fed, okay, September 2022, unrealized losses lowering tangible equity capital. Now, all this stuff, by the way, all the stuff within the banking sector, so much of it is written in an intentionally opaque way. And you'll see all these people tweeting things like, lol, tell me you don't know what an X is without telling me you don't know what an X is. Like, tell me you don't know what a tangible equity capital is. And the thing is, in 2008, you know what they would have said? They would have said, tell me you don't know what a CDO is without telling me you don't know what a CDO is. And the whole point was that nobody really knew what a CDO was, including the guy selling it. They just used, fancy words and complicated math on top of what was actually a piece of shit, right? Basically houses that didn't have any value. And that's exactly what they've done here, where there's all these kind of complicated words on top of something where fundamentally the money is gone, right? The banks do not actually have assets sufficient to cover their liabilities. And it's not just Silicon Valley Bank, and it's not just Credit Suisse, and it's not just First Republic. It's hundreds and hundreds of banks. And you don't have to take my word for it. Go and look at this article. It's called Unrealized Losses Lowering Tangible Equity Capital. It's from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Okay, this is months ago. And again, in this banker coded language, at the end they say, at year end, only 4 community banks, so at the end of 2021, only 4 community banks had tangible equity capital ratios below 5%. That number increased to 333 at June 3rd, 2022, indicating less ability to sustain economic shocks. You'd think. And so, they don't actually define what tangible equity capital is. This is like, but basically what they're saying is we went from maybe 4 banks that could be considered insolvent to 333 in a year, not even a year, 6 months, okay? A 75x increase in 6 months. And how did that happen? Well, they actually admitted at the top. They say the rising interest rate environment has led to unrealized loss positions, meaning the Fed, hiked rates and basically devalued all of the bonds that they had sold everybody in the previous year. Now, another thing, by the way, just like I talked about the intentional opacity, another thing about the finance sector that you'll see is the people in it have 2 simultaneously, sort of contradictory beliefs. And the first is that the Fed is all powerful and that, Powell is more powerful than the president and we hang on every word and, our algorithms trigger on every single thing they do, don't fight the Fed, right? And the other thing they also believe at the same time, without really seeing the contradiction, is they'll say something like, oh, nobody really listens to the Fed. I have my own secret sauce that I add to my, forecast. I don't just do it straight. You're responsible for what your own trading strategy is. You can't blame them. If you're smart, you would have hedged, et cetera, et cetera. And this was kind of a weird thing that I had to kind of squint at as kind of an outsider in some ways to this and try and figure out how could they say that, the Fed was both all powerful and has zero responsibility for anything. I mean, last week, there was essentially people were saying that some, immigrant engineer or some, startup founder is responsible for diligencing a footnote in their bank's, statements that shows in a footnote that they're insolvent. But Powell isn't responsible for anything. And that doesn't actually make any sense. And there's a reason it doesn't make any sense. And the reason is, why was that insolvency hidden in a footnote? Why was it only discovered, through a bank run? Well, as you'll find out, the bank regulators and the banks and the central bank were aware of all the banks being insolvent and just did not notify you, the depositors. Okay, I know how crazy that is, but that's literally what has happened. Go ahead.
Is this an SV? So you're saying what happened to Silicon Valley Bank is effectively infected the entire commercial banking sector?
No, well, sort of in reverse. Every bank was affected by essentially what happened. The technical way of talking about it, see, it's encoded in all of this jargon and what have you. But the technical way of talking about it is, there's a New York Times article from August 25th, 2021. Banks are binging on bonds, but not because they want to. Okay, so basically, what happened with all the printed money, consumer loans, consumers weren't taking out loans anymore, and banks did think maybe there might be inflation, but at the same time, through 2021, even up until November 3rd, 2021, Powell was saying he'd be patient on hiking rates. Kashkari said, I think June 2021 that we'll keep rates low until 2023. And so in that environment, these banks were like, okay, our best bet is just buy a ton of bonds at even low percentage rates. Here's a quote from that New York Times article, August 25th, 2021. When the yield rose to around 1.75%, banks hungry for higher returns rushed to buy them. The thing is, this quickly gets technical, but the short version is the Fed faked out all the banks. It sold them a huge amount of bonds, and it told them it was going to be, selling something roughly the same for a while. And then suddenly, after Powell got renominated, he devalued all of them and stuck all the banks with massive devaluations of all the assets they just sold them. So what did the banks do? The banks were like, oh crap. And so the banks went to these bank CPAs, and there's this article called kind of a smoking gun, Rising Rates and Considerations for Held to Maturity Classification, okay? And so this fun article, and again, all of this is in that, tweet. I'll pin the tweet for a second so you guys can see it. Let me pin it. Okay, I'll pin it to my profile. Okay, so you guys can see this tweet, and just read the references, all right? So this article from ID Bailey or what have you, okay, if you go and look at the Open Graph preview of this, what they're literally saying is, wondering what you should do in reaction to large losses? We've got you covered. Held to maturity classification. In other words, this article is about how anxious bankers with their huge losses can hide it with this accounting trick. And then it's okay because then they preserve their regulatory stuff because all they care about is how they look to the regulators. No one cares about the actual depositors except if they were actually going to poke around and find out. Okay, that's all the way back in April 2022. So in short, the Fed surprised the banks, and the banks decided to surprise you. And I think things I can get into all the mechanics of this, but you guys know the meme of like the 50 IQ guy, 100 IQ, 150 IQ guy. You know that thing?
I've seen the memes.
You've seen the memes,
yeah.
right? So like the quote, the dumb version is, don't trust the banks. They're just lying to you. They're just trying to screw you with something in the fine print, blah, blah. And then the 100 IQ would be like, no, banks are a pillar of our society, blah, 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 blah. But what I've just kind of discovered on this is actually like that, with poking into this, because the whole thing is set up to sort of intimidate people from kind of poking into it and finding out, do you actually have the money, right? Just like the mortgage crisis of 2008. Like no banker, it's weird, 15 years later, people have forgotten the lessons of 2008, which is don't even trust these guys when, if their mouth is moving, like the level of lies is actually bananas, right? They're basically their own tribe of central bankers, and, bank regulators that is distinct from the tribe of the depositors who are like, they're victims / customers or whatever, right? And what they basically did is over the last year is they were just trying to figure out how do we hide the fact that we have these gigantic unrealized losses. That's a key phrase, okay? And if you look at this tweet that I've pinned, there's links to the Fed, to FDIC again, to the Fed, to the bank CPAs. It's like 5 links all through before the SVB crash, showing that they were aware that, in that Fed link, literally hundreds of banks were insolvent, okay? But most of the time, people don't discover that insolvency because they don't actually try to get all of their money back at once, right? There isn't a, quote, bank run. So, exactly what they were thinking about doing, I don't know. Is there some centralized plan? I mean, the Fed is centralized, but, like, it's also chaotic, right?
Can I ask you about that centralized
also,
plan?
Balaji, let me just real quick. So basically, you're betting that the asymmetric information framework we've had, where like some of us know what Bitcoin is, we know it's the only digital asset with no counterparty risk.
Yes.
We know it's very valuable. We know that most people don't understand this. You're basically betting that this is a trigger moment for like the market to like snap into understanding for that.
Look, I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, but we are all Bitcoin maximalists now. Okay? Bitcoin is the exit. It is the one asset that is not going to be seized. I mean, basically, everybody's kind of known. Let me actually go in an interactive way, okay? So just to summarize what I just said, hundreds of banks are insolvent. The central bank, the banks, and the banking regulators themselves all hid this with various kinds of accounting tricks that were approved in the space. And they were just trying to like let it slide forever and hope that something changed. And then it exploded when, one guy, when Bern Hobart looked through the, ridiculously long bank filings and so on and found in a footnote that somehow this bank, this long SEC filing, it buried in a footnote that it, had a negative $80 billion a classification and hold to maturity of $80 billion is like this gigantic increase. So essentially they buried their insolvency in literally a footnote. And he figured it out, and that's actually what led to the SVB bank run. And the thing about it is all the banks are like that. And what's about to happen this week, if you Google the term discount window, okay, they use all this terminology and so on to confuse you, and like 15 different definitions of the money supply, blah blah blah. But the discount window is pretty clear. Essentially, a bunch of these insolvent banks, which Wall Street Journal, by the way, if you Google Wall Street Journal, dozens of banks may have risks similar to Silicon Valley Bank. Okay, so you put it together. There's like 186 banks prone to similar risks. All these banks are at the so-called discount window with this new printing program that the Fed just set up. They've got $150 billion that's come in. So what they've decided to do, everybody knew they were going to monetize the debt. Like we all knew that, right? Robert, you knew they were going to monetize the debt.
Well, yeah, that's what the central bank is designed to do.
That's right.
No question.
And they've done it gradually for a long time. Dalio knows they're going to monetize the debt. Alex, did you know they were going to monetize the debt?
Well, they've been doing it for a long time, and they're going to continue to do it. So yeah.
Exactly, right? So we all knew that. So strategically, they don't have surprise. But tactically, they had surprise until this. Because the way they've decided, or whether I call it even decided, whether it's conscious or it's like, think of an ant colony, right? It's a bunch of ants doing their own thing, and it's like, but the ant colony kind of moves, right? Whether it's decentralized, centralized, doesn't actually matter. I'm just going to talk about it as the emergent decision is to monetize the debt in the messiest way possible with an orgy of money printing and bank runs basically this week. If you add on top of that, like Trump's claimed arrest and him calling for guys in the streets, okay, this week is going to be, unfortunately, madness, all right? And again, this has absolutely nothing to do with me or with tech or with Bitcoin or anything like that. This is a completely Fed caused situation, as all those timestamps show, right? Everybody here is like coding or you're thinking about math, AI, whatever, all that stuff, okay? The banks bankrupted the banks and they wanted to pin it on somebody, or the emergent system decided, oh, it's a great opportunity to pin it on somebody. But now it's hard for them to pin it on anybody. They're just printing and it's just going to be absolute chaos because all the banks wouldn't get like 150 billion or whatever in this discount borrowing, right? Did you see Robert, do you see my QT of your thing with that discount borrowing thing? Do you see that?
I don't see that actually. Here. I do have a question. If you're ready though.
Please.
Okay, so just real quick, to decrypt this for the audience, perhaps, monetize the debt. What we're basically saying is there's an implicit default on the debt occurring through fiat currency supply inflation. Right? They're printing money to paper over otherwise unpayable debts. I think that's what we mean when we say monetize the debt.
Yes.
My question for you is, you mentioned the possibility of a centralized plan. I think the most obvious centralized plan would be the corralling of people into a central bank digital currency.
Right. So
as I see it, the commercial banking sector is the only impediment to a full-blown CBDC. So isn't this just the central bank flexing its powers to try and wipe out the impediment of the commercial banking sector?
Well, so here's the thing. Basically, like my take on a lot of these guys is they're kind of like a meta-organism where I don't know if any of them has actually any master plan, but it's sort of like, think about how, in a sense, like a decentralized currency and a centralized currency can facilitate a payment, but in very different ways, right? Like one is sort of conscious and centralized and planned, the other is an emergent property of a community, right? So, but I'll talk about it. Let me talk about it as if there was a centralized plan, but it's like, call it an emergent plan, right? The emergent plan is sort of something like this, or like, let's say the V2 plan, which is, it is essentially the combination of hyperinflation, destroy all of the local banks, because if you're seeing these big banks that are normally competitors are in the fog of war, snapping up, First Republic or Credit, like all the too big to fail banks are, quote, bailing out. But what are they bailing out these small banks with? Basically like some of the money that was effectively loaned to them by the Fed, right? So it is effectively a stealth nationalization where tons of money is printed, and then the big banks, the too big to fail banks, are snapping up the small banks, and others are just being set on fire. And the end state of that is exactly what you're saying, which is people are like, oh my God, my small bank won't work. And the false door is for them to flee to a big bank, to send all their wires to a big bank, right? Because a small bank is set on fire, your regional community bank is set on fire. It was, basically devalued by the Fed.
Can I just add can I add a political element to what you're saying? I guess what we're talking about here is the nationalization of bank deposits.
That's right.
And I mean that both in the financial sense and in the political sense, meaning, the government's going to get to determine which bank deposits are valid and not. I think that we're, a ways away, obviously, from any sort of operational CBDC. But that's the point of the CBDC. That's the point of a CBDC in theory, is to remove the power of the private sector and of the commercial banking sector, and just go straight to have this relationship between the state and the citizen with money, and replace cash, and have this liability of the central bank that you have in your pocket that they can do easy stimulus with, and they can do blacklisting and censorship and surveillance in a very easy manner without having to deal with the tech sector or with the banking sector. And that's why the Chinese government's pushing a CBDC, is it's tired of fighting with these big tech companies.
That's right.
So, I'd be careful about saying we're going to see an operationalization of you having a credit on your phone that's actually a liability of the Fed, in the next year or whatever. But this paves the way for it for sure. But what I think just to finish my last point, what it immediately paves the way for is, as we saw Yellen be interviewed in Congress the other day, the total politicization of bank deposits. Basically, the Fed will determine what's important and not, in concert with the Treasury, and the government will start to sort of really take over this aspect of life, which at one point was a very private sector thing, 100 plus years ago. So we're witnessing the end of that, and at the same time, again, my interpretation of your bet is that people have a choice. There's this optional thing that's popped out that people have this plan B, and that maybe the collective realization is now that this is an insurance policy on that happening.
That's right.
That's my interpretation of your bet. And I probably wouldn't make your bet, but I certainly wouldn't bet against it. And I think that this is going to happen at some point in the next decade, and who knows when. We should just be humble about the fact that we just don't know when it's going to happen.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts on that. So first is, did you see FedNow?
Yeah, they're moving along. Yeah, they're like, wait a second, we've got progress.
Yeah, so exactly. So March 15th, in the middle of this gigantic crisis, which was obviously a stop the presses kind of thing where they announced this, they also found the time to announce the launch of FedNow, which is, people have called it, quote, CBDC light. Maybe it's not so light. If at the end of all of these bank runs, it's effectively something where, all the small banks, community banks, banks that are, run in Republican states or tech banks, basically if you want to be really actually talking about the tribes, right? Blue tribe versus gray tribe versus red tribe. Blue tribe has gone after the tech banks, like SVB and Silvergate and so on. But it's also actually going after the red banks, all these community banks. And again, whether it's intentional or not, or emergent, kind of doesn't matter. The emergent is this, right? So all of those, the tech banks, the red banks get, destroyed for different reasons, and are effectively nationalized by the too big to fail banks, which then, of course, banks are already terrible. But if there's only 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever of them, they're even worse. And then you've corralled everybody in over here, and then it's really easy to do a CBDC. But the other thing is that I hadn't thought about hyperinflation and CBDC happening at the same time, with all the small banks getting wiped out or acquired. And that is that's not really nice, right? That's not good at all. That basically gets you to it gets you to a China-like state.
Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, iCoin Technology. iCoin has just released a sleek new hardware wallet. Looks like a mini iPhone, a little touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, no GPS. It's a strictly physically cold hardware wallet. Like I said, it's got a high-res 3-inch touchscreen. It's got a camera for air gapping the wallet. It's got optional Bluetooth compatibility. And it's really a brand new UI, UX experience for a hardware wallet, making it very accessible, easy to use, not intimidating. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like iCoin Wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. Go to iCointechnology.com today and use promo code Bitcoin23 for 30% off of this new sleek hardware wallet. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Ledn. Ledn lets you do more with your digital assets. For instance, Ledn offers a B2X loan product that lets you leverage your existing Bitcoin to buy even more Bitcoin. Or you can also get traditional Bitcoin collateralized US dollar loans through Ledn as well. Ledn also offers both Bitcoin and USDC denominated savings accounts, letting you generate yield on your digital assets. Recently, Ledn has launched a Bitcoin mortgage product as well that lets you use Bitcoin to buy a home or finance one that you already own. So go to ledn.io, that's LEDN.io today to sign up.
Just to interject a very brief thing, the fear of a lot of the commercial bank folks when they get interviewed about CBDCs, of course, is that in times of prosperity and bubble and stimulus, it's fine. But like in times of risk and danger, everybody will withdraw their funds from commercial bank assets over to CBDCs because they'll have the full protection of the government because it's a direct liability of the Fed. That's like the fear of a lot of people on the commercial side of things. So, I think it could go down exactly as you say, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is basically if the commercial banks, the local banks were the barriers to a CBDC, and they're suddenly all just wiped out and destroyed, and there's gigantic chaos and loss of trust, and the only people trust is bigness, right? And why do they trust the bigness? Because the Fed causes the crisis with one hand by devaluing all these bonds, and that it fakes out the local banks. It has them buy huge amounts of bonds. They got huge amounts of deposits with the pandemic, right? It fakes them out, has them buy these huge bonds. It devalues all of them. It crashes them to zero, but it doesn't bail them out directly. It gives it to the big banks to acquire them. But essentially, in the process of this, already $150 billion has hit the bank. Do you see the graph that I posted where it's literally just going?
Yeah.
Right?
No, it's insane, but it's also Operation Choke Point, as Nick Carter keeps pointing out, 2.0, because now they can say, oh, you do business with cannabis, you do business with Bitcoin, you do business with prostitution. They can decide guns, whatever. They can just decide a sector, and they can just say, "Oh, we're not gonna backstop you." And I mean, that's like an extinction thing moving forward, basically.
That's right.
If you're using government money that's not guaranteed, and other people are using government money that is guaranteed, I mean, it's game over.
That's exactly right. And actually, Punk6529, who might be in the chat or something, he had a really good post a while back, which is that there's no practical freedom without freedom to transact, right? For example, you want to buy a sign to protest. Well, maybe you can't do that because that vendor is, marked bad with the CBDC, right? Literally, if every single action, they can do things like the money depreciates out of your account unless you spend it right now. And moreover, you can't exit the system. I mean, can you move your data off of Facebook? Not really, right? So you might be able to buy physical goods and you carry them, but you can't actually carry out your liquid net worth, and anything that probably was something that would allow capital flight, they could stop. And the reason we know that's possible, at least, is China's rolling out a bunch of those things. And so, the threat is real, right? But
just one more thing to stir the pot, and then I'll let you react. In the global South, we see things differently in terms of how economies face crises like this. Like a typical global South economy has very, very high interest rates and very, very high inflation. And what we may be starting to see here potentially is what you would call deflation, literally deflation. The economy is going to shrink potentially. You're going to have a massive crash where credit is destroyed, right? In a normal crash scenario, this is a deflationary event. But I think people have been misled to think that in a deflationary event, you wouldn't have high inflation in the currency. That's not true at all. And in fact, that's the norm in the global South. What you see is economies shrink and get destroyed and contract and deflate, while at the same time, the local currency gets massively devalued. This is just normal in emerging markets or in the global South. For most of the world's population, this is what they deal with. If you look at Egypt right now, this is what's happening. So domestic stocks get slaughtered. Domestic bonds get slaughtered. Food and energy gets really expensive. Some scarce assets like gold might develop a huge premium, but a lot of the financial stuff that people trade around, crashes also. So, I think there's a chance we see something like that here if your bet, happens at any point where you see food and energy and things like Bitcoin and real estate, some real estate and gold, have a premium. but like a lot of other things like get trashed. I mean, so I think we need to open our minds to like things might be different this time around.
Yes.
Like, you know, if the reserve currency stuff starts to get called into question, it won't look like this anymore. It'll look more like what it looks like for most people in the world, and they can teach us about what that kind of experience looks like and what you need to do to prepare yourself. And I'll end there.
That's right. And exactly. And the thing is, you know, like as an immigrant, many people who are immigrants are familiar with a situation where they, you know, basically things go to hell like pretty quickly. And, you know, people from China, people from Russia, people from Vietnam, you know, people from Iran, like people from Eastern Europe, South America, much of the world has had a lot of tragedies, unfortunately, you know, this last century and even the last few decades. And so it is this thing where, you know, at least in the US, you kind of flip the channel and you say, oh, you know, that sucks for them over there, you know, some guys with, you know, some chaos, and you just flip to, I don't know, some TV show. Okay. But to your point about why is quote this time different? Now, by the way, this concept, you know, within banking or whatever, they'll say when anybody says this time is different, they'll just quote that and be like, oh, of course, haha, you're saying this time is different. That means you're stupid. And of course, the opposite of this time is different means things never change, right? And what they've done is they've taken a quote which you know, I guess was in some other context, like talking about a deal that wouldn't work, and then reinterpreted to mean nothing ever changes, this time is never different, it's always the same, or whatever. Or just it's kind of mindless kind of use of the language. But things do change. And one of the think about the big differences versus the 2008 crisis. So in the 2008 crisis, which, by the way, we're already beyond in terms of the discount borrowing levels. I'll just quote from this this QZ thing. Again, just like I knew this, but it's good to see the U.S. media admitting it. The Fed's discount window is lending to banks at 2008 levels. Banks recently borrowed $152 billion from the Fed plus from a new emergency loan program, so shattering records. So we're already past 2008. Okay, so therefore comparisons to 2008 are not off base. In 2008, though there was, quote, a financial crisis, people know that we, quote, printed our way out of it. And what that means is actually two things. First, it does mean like the, quote, American taxpayer bailed out the banks. That is true. But the second and less well understood thing that you're well aware of, I think, Alex, is that the world bailed out America. All the dollar holders abroad, inflation was exported there. And this was at least picked up and reported on, like the Arab Spring. All the chaos caused there was in part because of food prices. Like that guy, poor guy set himself on fire in part because of food prices. You recall that, Alex?
Yeah.
And Robert, have you studied that? Do you know about that? Like the exporting of inflation from the U.S.?
Well, yeah. So the deal with that is you've got 330 million U.S. citizens. We have $4.5 billion holders or dollar users worldwide. So when we print dollars, we're exporting in quotation marks, 90% of that inflation. Now, that's not perfect because that's based on number of people, not actual capital accumulated in those hands, but it's a rough proxy, I think, for what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing about it, by the way, is the system has evolved. And when I say evolved, by the way, I mean like literally like evolution. You know, for example, nobody designed a chameleon. Okay, it just managed to have this kind of camouflage, right? Nobody designed the so-called mimic octopus. If you Google the mimic octopus, nobody designed the beetles that kind of look like their surroundings. What has happened is finance has evolved such that everything that was like easy to understand and whatnot just basically got selected against because then people could see how the other guy was screwing them, right? The thing is, finance, a lot of it is so zero sum that person A to sell something to person B, like, you know, on Wall Street, they'll say something like, how are you screwing me, right? Because it's so zero sum. And within Wall Street, they know to kind of be suspicious of each other, I guess. But outside, people still trust banks. But coming back to your point, everything in the financial system is optimized to sort of hide how they're screwing you. And so that's why it's like, oh, you can't get like an exact figure on how many dollars there are. You can't get an exact figure on how much people are being taxed effectively to hold the dollar, all the dollar holders. How much are people being inflated? The whole thing is sort of set up such that it's complicated enough that it's hard to actually account for that. It's not like 21 million Bitcoin where it's simple, right?
The other important thing is that it's not like 2020. This is, you know, they're not like doing massive fiscal in terms of putting money in our bank, in our retail bank accounts. This is more like, again, what people experience in the emerging markets, where like the system starts to crumble from the inside, and you see like these kind of structural adjustment policies come into play. So, our societies don't want that. Like Britain right now has an energy price cap, right? So they're like draining their reserves and risking price inflation so that the people don't get angry. That's like a luxury that we can do in our societies in like the advanced economies for now. I mean, a lot of these countries, Japan, Switzerland, they have these massive reserves of US treasuries that are, 800 billion, $1 trillion that they can draw down on just in case some shit goes down. But eventually, if the quality of those treasuries starts to get called into question, that causes what you're trying to say, Balaji, basically. So you're basically, again, making a bet that moment's going to happen in the next 90 days.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's sort of already happening. I mean, in the sense of that graph where, like, I posted the BitSignal tweet before that, you see the BitSignal where like the graph goes vertical like that, right? I posted that before the discount window graphs came online, to my knowledge, at least. It looks like all of them are stamped 2 or 3 hours or whatever later, right? So that's exactly what one would predict. And I think one of the biggest differences, so a few big differences from 2008, okay? The first is social media is, not just built out, but people have been on social media for a while. There's all kinds of crises that have happened on social media. That was not the case in 2008. Number two, Bitcoin exists. So there's actually an exit to the dollar. Number three, and this is totally different from Bitcoin, and this is actually the bad part, the China, Russia, like a bunch of countries have already been doing a fair amount of progress on non-dollar denominated trades, as you're probably aware, right? All the petrodollar stuff. So it's kind of like how remote work was at like 20, 30 something percent or whatever percent prior to the pandemic, and then just went totally vertical afterwards, right? The pandemic, took those things that were existing solutions and then push them from 20% or 30% share or whatever it was to like 70 or 80% share. I think that's going to happen across the board because one of the other big differences with 2008 is, at least I did not remember bank runs in 2008 in the same way. Like I didn't remember, frantic consumers, right? It was all sort of enterprise markdowns and, it was like on the back end. It wasn't like the liquid front end assets, your checking account. I might be wrong about that. I may be.
I mean, the psychology of social media is, we saw it. It's terrifying what happened the other weekend. No, it really is.
Well, but here's the thing. I mean, there's both a good and a bad to social media, right? Obviously, there's a bad. But there's also a good, which is if there is a fire, if there's digital fire, see, they can't print. And like, if anybody's finding that the money is gone, right, in one of their banks and it's out and it's in like the middle of the Midwest or something like that, and every guy's finding out that's true at Florida, right? Like that can be communicated now and integrated in a way that's outside the mainstream media. And, like the thing is, of course, one doesn't want to quote panic, but it is also true that there are times when you need to be like, maybe there's a fire and maybe I want to, in a calm and, straightforward way, exit the building. And
well, one other thing to be really clear, like I'm very pro American values. I think that the American government's done a lot of things that are shameful and criminal, etc. But I think that what ends up happening here is it's not great for like other dictatorial powers. Like I see a lot of people on here, really excited about whatever it's the Chinese or the Saudis or the Russians. And I'm obviously very against that. And I think that's not going to work because those systems rely on three things: confiscation, censorship, and closed capital markets. That's how like the Chinese and Saudis and Russians run themselves. The United States at its core and its DNA is about free speech, property rights, and open capital markets. So I think on the other end of this thing, America comes out really strong. I'm pretty bullish on America in like 15, 20 years here still. But that doesn't mean that our currency won't start to collapse into something else. The thing is, for most other countries, again, they've already seen this before. Anyone here from Egypt or Turkey or Argentina can come on here to us and teach us about when things start to shake, everybody goes to dollars.
Yeah. So the new thing is, with social media and Bitcoin out there, and with several 100 million people worldwide with cryptocurrency, and also crucially, there are banking rails that are outside the U.S., right? And there are a lot of dollar holders outside the U.S. And I think it will be challenging. I mean, I don't have a map of all the crypto banks or whatever worldwide, but I think it will be challenging to block all of the exits, right? They have shut down Signature and they shut down Silvergate, and as Nick Carter and I think 0x Fubar documented, those were not, Signature wasn't a bank run; it was a murder, right? It wasn't actually insolvent, right? And so they're kind of blocking things again in like an emergent way, okay, but I don't think they can block all of the world's exits to Bitcoin because, there's many countries that are, like neutral or what have you. And I think also a lot of average Americans, by the way, like you, of course, I'm very pro the average American, but also like the average American, I am not very pro the U.S. government, right? And I think now, the difference between the two will be extremely obvious, where like the government, or at least specifically the media, the central banks, the banks, and the banking regulators have literally covered up a mass insolvency and tried to just like have it blow up in a fog of war kind of thing, so everybody's confused about what's happening. But if you take a look at those references, the most important thing you can take home from that is that the banks, the banking regulators, and the central bankers knew that the banks were insolvent and a huge crash was coming, the unrealized losses, but they never notified the depositors. Go ahead.
Can we talk about the magnitude of the quantitative easing you're expecting to see here? Like, I know we talked offline that they're basically going to monetize all of the debt. So what does that mean? Does that mean $30 trillion in QE is coming down the pipe in the next short order?
Well, also they did 9 trillion.
Yeah,
they did 9 trillion of government securities and real estate between the end of the GFC and early 2022. And again, most of that was not reflected in CPI, in like the inflation that we would normally talk about, because it didn't come into into the real economy. But it made the most massive asset bubble of all time, right? So the question is, are they going to do something more similar to that, where the effects are more similar to that? And I'm thinking this is actually a deflationary event in terms of the size of the economy starting to shrink, because this fiat bubble is just so big. I don't know if it can get any bigger. But you see certain things get more expensive and you see the currency devalue. That's like my main sort of thesis here.
Yeah. So one thing about it, by the way, Robert, is they're not calling it quantitative easing this time. They're calling it the BTFP program and so on. And part of the goal here is just keep changing the words so that, somebody who doesn't know everything can seem and look stupid or whatever. But basically, one thing you can track is and I've got a thing here on this. When the so-called BTFP program, actually, the best article to read on this is Arthur Hayes' article, Crypto Hayes, right? Awesome article on exactly, if you want the 150 IQ version of exactly how they're screwing you and you want every mechanical detail and so on, he will give that to you. But if you don't want that, you can just look at the fact that the money going to the banks is going vertical, and then you can figure out later the exact, I don't know, velocity and magnitude of the tsunami that's about to hit, right? And this the thing about in terms of the amount, the difference with this one is like it just feels very perceptible. It is something where it is. I mean, you didn't have 40,000 companies were banking at SVB, this 40-year-old institution, and one day they woke up and they learned that the money was gone, right? That is, and this is very important. They were then blamed for running a business checking account and wanting a bailout. Now let me just talk about that for a second, because that's if you're on misinformation. Okay, if you're walking down the street, actually let me put it like this. Let's say you went to Mogadishu, okay, and you wanted a helicopter airlift, okay. That's a bailout. That's like taking a very high risk activity and wanting someone else to pay for it. Okay. But if you're walking down the street and someone attacks you and you want police to help you, that's a paid for. You took a low risk activity, and your basic like taxes with your subscription, as a citizen, however you want to term it, that should pay for that, right? And similarly, sure, if you make a risky investment or something like that, that's and you want your money back, that's a bailout. But to want the bank regulator whose salary you're effectively paying to tell you that your bank is insolvent and give you some warning of it before a bank run, that's a paid for. And so the most important question that any depositor at SVB can ask is, why did the Fed and the FDIC know about the insolvency, not just of SVB, but every other bank, and allow them to just blow up in bank runs? right? That is the most important question, because when you ask that question, and that, like when you add up that, when you have that lens on the thing and you look at the links that I've put there, look at links 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in my, pinned tweet. Okay. When you realize that they knew that the banks were insolvent, but didn't tell the depositors, which includes all of you, every one of you has a deposit at a U.S. bank, right? If you go and read that language with an eye towards, oh, wait a second, they actually knew that the banks were insolvent, then yeah, there's a difference between, that's not a bailout. That's something where the state is like conspiring against you, or at least it's certainly not doing its job, and what you paid for didn't come through, right?
Right. So like, again, the moment is do people start to realize that every single institution, family unit, nation state, whatever, should have some percentage of this other thing that can never be frozen or confiscated if it's used properly, that literally has no counterparty risk. That's the question. And, maybe it doesn't happen here, and maybe we coast along and it is what it is, but that will happen at some point. I mean, people here should know that will happen this decade. And you want to think of yourself on the other side of that moment and think, well, what would I do differently if I had known that this was coming? You should just run that thought exercise. I think that's a very helpful thing to do.
My estimation, I always say that pain is information. Most people learn the hard way, kind of running their head into the wall and getting damaged by all this. So maybe a way to reformulate that question, Balaji, is what is the total shortfall of these insolvent banks across the country?
So I shouldn't say I have no idea, but let me actually quote you some numbers. Okay, the answer is I can approximate it by, like, for example, FDIC unrealized gains on and loss on investor security. I'm going to quote this FDIC report to you. Okay, this is from 2 days, March 6th, 2023, 2-3 days before the SUV thing. Okay, so Martin Gruenberg, FDIC chairman, not some random guy. Okay, the main guy. The total of these unrealized losses, including securities that are available for sale or held to maturity, was about $620 billion at year-end 2022. Okay, $620 billion is a lot of money, and that's just like the ones that he's counting up there. And there's the whole system is, as I said, set up for opacity. But if you do look at the graphs that they themselves are putting out, right, the ones at the bottom of my pinned tweet, the graph of the Fed's weekly remittances to Treasury, or the unrealized losses on the investment securities, or the tangible equity capital of the community banks, they're all just down and to the right. And they're down and to the right in like even an outsider can see this is like 6-7x off, or just completely different than what there was there before.
Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, CrowdHealth. CrowdHealth is a Bitcoin-enabled alternative to legacy health insurance. Now let's face it, legacy health insurance is an absolute scam. Nobody can explain this better than the legendary comedian Chris Rock.
Insurance. You got to have some insurance. You got to. That's an insurance. They shouldn't even call it insurance. They should just call it in case shit. Like, I give a company some money in case shit happens. Now, if shit don't happen, shouldn't I get my money back?
So with CrowdHealth, instead of just paying premiums that you'll never see again, you can hold part of this pool of savings in dollars and in Bitcoin through CrowdHealth. And when you have a health event, you can draw against this pool of communal savings. So go to joincrowdhealth.com/breedlove to learn more or sign up. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Wasabi Wallet. Wasabi lets you use Bitcoin privately while still maintaining full control over your money. Specifically, Wasabi Wallet is an open source, non-custodial wallet with privacy built in by default. By using Wasabi, you're effectively putting the private back in private property. Wasabi Wallet is an easy-to-use privacy wallet that can support any amount of Bitcoin transactions. So go to wasabiwallet.io today to download this state-of-the-art wallet software. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Bitcoin Conference 2023. This 3-day event will be held May 18th through 20th in Miami Beach. This is going to be the biggest event of the year, as it always is. And the past 2 years in Miami have simply been amazing. Day 1's Industry Day. Days 2 and 3 are going to be open to general admission. And I'd say this is a great place to go and network with Bitcoiners, or even look for a job. Just a really all-around great experience. There's a fantastic speaker lineup, including Michael Saylor, Zoltan Pozsar, Lynn Alden, Alex Gladstein, many others. And last year, we did a 10 million sats giveaway for this event, and we're going to do it again this year. So to get discounted tickets and enter for a chance to win 10 million sats, go to b.tc/conference and use code BREEDLOVE. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Casa. Casa makes it simple to buy and secure your Bitcoin without wondering whether you're doing it right. Specifically, Casa provides a multi-key custody solution, which is by far the most secure way to custody your Bitcoin. Now, when I talk about Bitcoin being theft-proof money or inviolable private property, a multi-key custody model is exactly what I am talking about. Using multiple keys lets you maintain full control of your Bitcoin while also giving you redundancy in case you lose one of the keys. It's also the best way to secure your Bitcoin for inheritance planning purposes. So go to keys.casa, that's C-A-S-A, today to sign up and use discount code BREEDLOVE.
In a real sense, and again, this is a very macro way of thinking about it, people have been saying like America's living on borrowed time, right? This is like the balloon payment coming at the end. If you take out debt, right, which you shouldn't do, okay, but if you did, often at the very end, there's like one giant payment. And in a sense, though, it's like not exactly that, but like you can kind of think of it like that. The bill is finally coming due for years or decades or whatever, wherever you want to date it, of like this crazy money printing. And it's all coming due at once. And it's coming due or they've either decided or emergently decided to have it come due in the messiest fashion possible, which is like bank runs on like 100 banks this week. And when I say 100, by the way, where am I coming up with that number? Well, on March 11th, everybody was saying, oh, these, evil tech guys, I can't believe they took risky bets, with their tech things and so on. But the only bet that SVB took that was like super risky in retrospect was buying treasury bonds and long-term government bonds. And then people were like, oh, they should hedge interest rate risk. Well, if every single bank is going down in the same way, is that a bank problem or is that a central bank problem, right? It's clearly a central bank issue. And so March 11th, that's what I said. I said what we're likely to see in the coming weeks is that this wasn't a single bank's issue, it was a central bank issue. And this was just as this SVB crisis was starting. And everyone's trying to pin it on, tech guys must have made some bets. They didn't. And then, like 10 days ago-ish, there were 0 dead banks. Now there's 5 dead banks, which are Silvergate, SVB, Signature, Credit Suisse, First Republic. Dead banks are a pretty big deal, right? Because one dead bank includes hundreds of billions of dollars, often of assets, right? And now the Wall Street Journal has admitted and basically confirmed, this, and it probably waited until, this time to put it out because they wanted the printed money to be there. But dozens of banks may have risks similar to Silicon Valley Bank. In a new study, economists said they found 186 banks that may approach similar risks. Well, again, that Fed report from September 2022, right? That was saying something very similar. It was saying the tangible equity capital, the unrealized loss in tangible equity capital was saying 333 community banks, had less ability to sustain economic shocks because of these mounting losses, right? So it was pretty clear to me, and again, if you notice, like I'm providing citations here, right? I'm providing charts, I'm providing figures. I've decoded enough of this to get the scale of it. And I knew this was coming about a week ago. What I didn't fully get was that they were, that they were basically going to think of this as like a digital Pearl Harbor of all dollar holders. Okay, the Federal Reserve itself is basically surprise attacking every dollar holder with a surprise devaluation of their dollars. Now, you know why that's not surprising? Because that's actually what they did in 2022. In 2022, one thing you'll find, even Tala, who's yelling online, he admits that long-term treasuries, like buying, betting on the long-term financial health of the United States of America in 2021 was like one of the worst bets you could make because everybody who did that, who bought the 10-year bonds or whatever there, not just treasuries, but other long-dated bonds, got absolutely destroyed in 2022. So in 2021, if you think about it, the worst bet was betting on the long-term financial health. And today, the worst bet is what some people are making where they're going into 3-month treasuries or something that's going to lock up their cash for 3 months. So now the worst bet is betting on the short-term financial health of the USA, unfortunately, because if you lock up the money that way, you're subject to obviously illiquidity risk and then devaluation risk. because the dollar is worth less, right? So your purchasing power declines. Obviously, you're paying something for locking it for 3 months. You don't get a 5% interest rate or whatever it is for nothing. You're sacrificing illiquidity and devaluation risk, but that's usually not a concern until now. And with billions and billions and billions of dollars flying around, the single most important thing to know is don't send your money to the big banks. Do put it into Bitcoin. And the reason Bitcoin, by the way, is Bitcoin is the Schelling point. You guys want to talk about the Schelling point? Robert, you know what that is?
Yeah, Alex had to drop, but yeah, I think Schelling point is useful. The other secondary question I'd like to add to that is all this sounds like one of, if not the biggest rug pull in human history. So obviously the punchline is, stay humble, stack sats, get your dollars out of banks into Bitcoin. Are there other actions though that people should be considering in light of all this?
Yes. So right, exactly. This is a gigantic rug pull, but the thing to remember is sovereign defaults are not actually that uncommon, right? And the U.S. banking system did rug pull American citizens during the mortgage crisis. And the same people who did BLM and said that there were mostly peaceful protests when there's fires burning in the background, those are the ones who are predominant within the state right now. Okay, so it's not actually that implausible. Or if you think about trust in media, right? People used to think the media were like neutral referees, and now they know that they're just like playing for their own team. They're not actually aligned with you. And that's why, trust in media has absolutely collapsed from, 30, 45%, 20 years ago to like 10, 15%. Now, 85% of people don't trust them, right? So the concept of such a rug pull on such a scale, yeah, you wouldn't have thought your bank would kind of do that to you. It's true. The stealth, the scale, and the speed of this sort of digital Pearl Harbor on dollar holders is bananas, right? But you can actually already see it coming. If you just forget about what's on TikTok or, TV, but just look for the term discount window and ask yourself, why is so much money rushing to the banks? It's because they expect all these bank runs. And then the question is, who can get their money out of the bank and into Bitcoin faster? Because if you're just sending it, the false door is you're sending it to a big bank, you're sending it to a GSIB, you're locking up for that 5%. The right door is Bitcoin. But then what's the next step? Well, the next step is you probably want to be in a crypto-friendly jurisdiction. Did you see my tweet on Texas, Robert?
I don't think I did. You also were going to talk about the Schelling point, just as a reminder.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah. So what's the Schelling point? It's like if you've got a bunch of people, a Schelling point is how they coordinate without coordinating. Okay, it's like you hit the fire alarm, and where's everybody going? They're going to the front door and the reassembly point. It's like the place across the street or something like that. Okay, Peter Thiel talked about the Bitcoin price, the BTC USD price, is the only unfakeable signal in global markets. Everything else is fake. Because obviously Chinese markets are totally fake, and many of the US markets are actually very fake. But that signal was a signal of exit, and it was very hard to fake because it was a real signal. And if that moons in time, it is a fire alarm that says that something is wrong and that the money is gone. Right? That is the signal that basically says, boom, like this, actually they're hyperinflating the currency, they're printing so much, and I'm getting to a safe haven. And once people see that mooning, then that becomes something that other people around the world see and other dollar holders see, and they realize, okay, a new reserve currency is being born. Okay. And this is actually probably how Bitcoin becomes what we've always thought it would be, which is the global reserve currency of the world. It's just something that's going to be much more messy, I think, than anybody expected. We thought it'd be much more gradual. We thought it'd happen, over time and so on. And there's gradual aspects of it. Of course, El Salvador has Bitcoin as reserve currency, and, CAR, and Panama's flirting with it. And certainly Florida has Bitcoin mayors. And actually, the thing I was just talking about, that relates to the second point. So the first point of the Schelling point, Bitcoin is the Schelling point, in the sense that if, as you've already seen, again, this is totally independent of me, all right? Totally independent of me. As you've already seen, $150 billion more than 2008 is moving to the discount window now, right? Number two is there's already, last year, one of the things I talked about last year, and again, I tweeted about this stuff and people have put it in place, anti-seizure bills. Are you familiar with that, Robert?
I don't think so, actually.
Yeah. So basically, the right to buy, sell, send, and receive Bitcoin shall not be infringed. Okay. That's like the 0th Amendment. Okay. That you can't take the money. Okay. And the thing about this is, let me see if I can find this.
This is like to inhibit an Executive Order 6102.
Yeah, exactly. Why don't you talk about Executive Order 6102? Go ahead. Tell people.
Yeah, so 1933, private gold ownership was outlawed under threat of, I think, 10 years imprisonment or, $10 or $20,000 fine, which was a lot of money in 1933. And I think that was said to be to support the war effort or something to that effect. But basically, it's bullshit, right? It's anti-capitalistic. It was a method to confiscate gold and then reprice it. So they gave everybody I think it was a 75% haircut, where gold was priced at $21 an ounce and it got repriced at 37, something like that. A couple of comments on the Schelling point. I like to think about it as the lowest common denominator strategy. It's if you're playing a game where people can't trust each other and their interests are inherently conflicted, it's kind of the strategy that everyone will default to. In a military sense, you could think that when your enemy starts carpet bombing you, you better build some damn high altitude bombers, right? Pretty quick, right? The high altitude bomber is the Schelling point effectively in that situation. And comment on the Bitcoin price. I've described it before as being like an irrepressible barometer for the fragility of the legacy financial system. So, there's a reason governments have gone to great lengths to try and suppress and manipulate the gold price. You could go to a website like gata.org, GATA.org. That's the Gold Antitrust Task Force, I think is what they're called. You could study things like the London Gold Pool, where governments have colluded to suppress and manipulate the price of gold for this very reason, right? I think Alex Greenspan said this in one of his communications a long time ago, that you have to outlaw access to a sound store of value for a fiat currency system to work. Because if people have an option to put their money in something safe, right, that can't be inflated, confiscated, et cetera, that's obviously where they're going to move their money. You have to restrict that option in order to get people to participate in a fiat currency system for a long period of time. I'll throw it back over to you on that.
Yeah. So basically, on the Schelling point thing, that's why I'm just saying Bitcoin only. We are all Bitcoin maximalists now. To be clear, I personally do believe you're going to need scalable, systems and so on the other side of this. But right now, just get to the exit, have people pile in, and make sure that the thing moons so people know that something's wrong. One thing about this with the anti-seizure bills, just talking about that in Executive Order 6102, one of the theses in my book, The Network State, is that 1950 is like a peak centralization moment where there is one telephone company and 2 superpowers and 3 television stations. And as you go forward and backward in time, you see things where there's the opposite version happening. For example, 1991, the internet frontier opens, but 1890, the American frontier closes. You go forward in time and you've got COVID-19. You go backward in time, you've got the Spanish flu. You go forward in time and you have, for example, China is a senior partner in the China-Russia alliance. But you go backwards in time and the Russians are the senior partner in the Russia-China alliance. Or for example, you go forward in time and you have India becoming a larger economy than Britain, and there's an Indian guy actually now as Prime Minister of Britain. You go backwards in time, you have Britain a larger economy than India, and a British guy, going and running India, right? And there's actually so many parallels like this. Another version is, you go forwards in time and you have the New York Times siding with Ukraine versus, Russia. And you go backwards in time and you have the New York Times, like Walter Duranty, siding with Stalinist Russia to choke out Ukraine. And it's like this really weird thing where, not all those events are happening in the exact same order, but it's almost like an origami thing where I don't pretend to understand it. I just got a list of like 50 of these events. But one of them is, with gold, for example, in the late 1800s, there was William Jennings Bryan, and there was a anti-gold movement, where it's like, we're a populist anti-gold movement, and he didn't want to be impaled on a cross gold, wanted people to print the money, et cetera. Okay, or what we'd call printing the money, and here today we have a populist pro-gold movement, which is essentially Bitcoin and Bitcoin maximalism. And with Executive Order 6102, the reason I think that worked, that was the seizure of gold. And that was when the state was becoming strong. So the centralized centuries, like ramping into 1950, you just have massive, massive, massive centralization. You have these giga states of like, the USA and the USSR and Nazi Germany and China. And so like hundreds of millions of people. That's not what the world used to look like. Looked like lots of small states it used to be. So you have this giant centralized century. And in that centralization ramp, centralized states were able to seize the gold from people. And in fact, Executive Order 6102 was like in some ways the nicest version of that. You know what the bad version was, Robert?
I guess the bad version would have been World War II, right? When Hitler invades Poland and goes to their central bank and seizes all their gold by force.
Well, yeah, sure, that's one version. But even the domestic version is what happened in the Soviet Union. Like Lenin's hanging order, right? Like go and hang the kulaks and take their farms and kill them. Hang the kulaks. The kulaks were basically like they're basically like entrepreneurs, like farmers in Russia. Or Mao, he went after the landlords, killed them, took their property. Cambodia, Pol Pot, he went after the guys with glasses. All of these countries, right? There's a history of asset seizure, of killing the guys who are upper middle class or even just ambitious in some way. That's unfortunately like the history of many people around the world. That we don't actually hear about too much, of course, it is good and we should know everything about fascism. And, with China, that's actually, probably kind of the closest thing to what they are. But we should also know about communism, and we don't know enough about that and exactly what happened, despite the fact there's lots of Chinese Americans and Vietnamese Americans and Koreans and so on that are victims of that. So the point being that the seizure of assets that FDR executed was like the least bad version of that. Because it wasn't like, house to house with guns or what have you. I think that today, now, so basically one of the things that meant, by the way, is physical gold was defeated by the state in the early 1930s, okay? And after 2008, a lot of gold bugs thought, buy gold, that's gonna stop the Fed is gonna print so much and gold is gonna move. And it didn't. And one of the reasons it didn't is first, people bought them in what we'd call a custodial way. They buy it like Speeder Gold Trust or something like that, if that's still around. But second is, even if you did buy a physical block of gold, it's not like useful in a modern economy, really. It might be useful like for a central bank or something. But, first, it's heavy. Second is it's hard to value for somebody who's just like looking at it. You need like special instruments or whatever to see if it's true gold or fool's gold. Third, you can't really chip off a flake too easily and give it to somebody, right? Fourth is, it's not something where when you sell it to somebody OTC, you can't get a price for it very easily. You don't have a universal price. All of that kind of stuff is why.
Yeah, the big one I would point out, Balaji, is just the fact that it's not portable, especially relative to something like Bitcoin. So what happens is there's huge economic advantages to just centralize the custody of gold and trade paper derivatives on top of it. Well, what does that do? That introduces this 100 to 1, paper to real gold market we have today that's used to suppress the price. So obviously Bitcoin doesn't suffer from that lack of portability, and that's why I think it's fundamentally different in this case. But again, I think the point you're making there is not your keys, not your coin, right? Not your gold. The paper certificate's not enough. You have to have the physical gold in your possession, just like you have to have the private keys in your possession.
Yeah. But
to prevent the price manipulation.
What I'm saying is like physical gold is sort of allowed to stick around because the state hasn't. The state has defeated it. It's in I would consider it gelded, right? It's not truly. It's fine. I'm glad people are still into gold and so on. Digital gold, however, has not yet been defeated. That is to say, it's not yet like all. Go ahead.
I was just going to add the central banks worldwide / the state, they own about 25% of the total global gold supply. That data might be a little bit old, but that's not the case with digital gold.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is that, one of the things I have in the Network State book is this concept of God, state, and network. And the question is like, what do you think is the most powerful force in the world? Because that informs one's philosophy and way of thinking and so on. Is the most powerful force in the world Almighty God? Is it the U.S. military or, the state's military? Or is it encryption, right? And each of those that's like God, state, network. Those are three very different, like worldviews. And there's fusions of them as I talk about in the book and so on. But, the state beat the people of God in the early 20th century, like obviously, the Soviet Union, went and killed lots of, religious people. Obviously, the Nazi Germany killed many Jewish people. But the network has not really had the real showdown with the state. That's been like the tension over the last, 10 or 20 years where, like tech companies, open source protocols, all this stuff is kind of running rings around, these like state regulators and these folks with sort of centralized power. And so like that sort of bubbling kind of thing where there's been many different sort of battlefronts or whatever you want to call them, tensions, points of conflict. And even in the US, by the way, you can sort of think of conservatives like red tribe is people of God, progressives, blue tribe are people of the state, like gray tribe is like people of the network. And of course, there's overlaps and stuff, and that's simplification. But I think one of the fundamental concepts is people of the state think that, violence in some form is enough to solve any problem, whereas like Julian Assange has written that no amount of violence can solve certain math problems, right? And in particular, cannot take the Bitcoin private keys. And we've had 13 years of a good security track record with Bitcoin. And so unlike dollars, you can hit dollars and you can mass inflate them and effectively seize them, but you can't do that for Bitcoin. And so, or at least that is the thing that may get tested, right? Like, can you actually seize the Bitcoin? And that's why I think there's both like technological, but then there's also sociopolitical, barriers to that. And that's why I think that Texas GOP thing, Marie asked, like, what are the things you do? So buy Bitcoin, but also crypto-friendly jurisdictions are probably good to check out. For example, Texas GOP has that language of shall not be infringed. And there's other states that are crypto-friendly. For example, Wyoming has a DAO law, Tennessee has a DAO law, Florida's mayor, not Florida's mayor, Miami, Florida's mayor, Francis Suarez, holds Bitcoin. Mississippi and Montana, thanks to some, great Bitcoin activists, have passed crypto mining bills, right? And Texas GOP has this. So there's actually quite a few states that have already kind of gotten into cryptocurrency and what have you. And those are probably good places where, like property rights and so on are protected. So I think that's the other kind of thing you think about. And then, of course, abroad, there's El Salvador, but there's also UAE, there's, like the Palau and Marshall Islands. There's a bunch of these sort of crypto-friendly spots around the world. There's Eastern Europe, spots there, and so I'd say those jurisdictions are going to do well in the event that something like this happens because they're crypto-friendly and they'll be sort of first movers.
I think that's really good advice. And I would say, Nietzsche captured this really well in his old quote that everything that the state has is stolen. Everything it says is a lie. And that sounds like a pretty damning indictment on the surface. But I think as we're starting to see in the world, it's pretty damn accurate, especially in times of crisis. So the key here is informing people, right? You need to hold some form of wealth that cannot be easily confiscated. And to that end, I don't think there's anything better in the world than Bitcoin, right? Which is the big punchline here. We are about 10 minutes over the time that we said we would go. Do you have any closing remarks?
Yes, one more closing remark. So just on that, right? There's actually this guy named Jean-Claude Juncker, and he is a central banker, and I think he's the former head of the Eurozone. And his famous quote is, when things get serious, you have to know how to lie. Okay, that's like the central banker quote. Now, why is he saying that? It's actually like, Sam Bankman-Fried saying FTX is fine, assets are fine. Okay, he's trying to stop people. Look, everything's fine. You don't have to come and you don't have to go and check on your money. It's all here. Don't worry about it. This guy's totally making it up. Competitors going after us with false rumors. Okay, and what that's very similar to is, like the Jerome Powell or the Federal Reserve Board saying on March 12, 2023, the capital and liquidity positions of the U.S. banking system are strong and the U.S. financial system is resilient. Would they actually have to put that out there unless, and even they've already kind of made stuff up, right? They said they'll make available up to $25 billion. It does not anticipate it will be necessary to draw on those backstop funds. So they're just saying, don't worry about it. We've got this backup plan. And on the other hand, they're saying, okay, banks, go and get the money right now. We're going to have a big print, right? Because, they're saying, 25 billion wouldn't be necessary, but now we have this 150 billion tsunami coming, right? So you have to actually look at the actions, not the words, and they do a lot to kind of cover those actions or announce them, so it's too slow for you to react. And hopefully I've given you guys time to react, okay? Take a look at some of these graphs, take a look at the charts, The reason I'm burning this money, one thing I want to be very clear about is there's no way on earth that this makes any money, because if I'm correct, or even close to correct, why would I not use the purchasing power to buy more Bitcoin today than in the future? $1 million that buys 40 Bitcoin or thereabouts. When I did it, and I get 1 Bitcoin in the future, and plus I get $1 million worthless dollars. And the reason is that I'm doing it to ring a fire alarm, because I do love many like things about this current world, and I do like I was born in the U.S. I love many Americans, and I think they've been defrauded by the government on this, and I think it's good to ring the fire alarm and show that actually something bad is happening. And the thing is, when I put up the bit signal, this discount window graph had not yet hit, and now that it has, and it looks kind of similar to that bit signal, I think it's worth taking a look and doing, quote, do your own research if you want. Take a look at how much they're printing, see that it's already beyond 2008, and ask yourself if you want to hold USD and what's about to happen, or if you want to at least hedge with BTC.
I think that is some sound advice. And Balaji, thank you for doing this. I hope this has been useful and valuable for everyone. And go out there and buy some damn Bitcoin and escape this controlled collapse that appears to be on the horizon.
Thanks, guys. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.